Okay, today we're going to be looking at methodology and in particular changes in methodology. Why does methodology change? There are some obvious answers to that. One is that we find that things that we've been doing in the classroom don't work and we look for alternatives. However, I think there's a little bit more behind it than that. And I want to suggest that there are three things which affect the methodologies that we use, and that they are developments in linguistics, developments in psychology, and socioeconomic factors. What do we mean by those three things? By development in linguistics, I'm talking about the way we actually see language. You have a handout, I hope you've got it in front of you, which shows exactly what linguistics is composed of. And you've got things like morphology and syntax, phonetics, and so on. One of those things is pragmatics, the investigation of the way people actually use language. Well, 50 years ago, that didn't actually exist. It's something that's been developed in the last 40 or so years, 30, 40 years. And therefore it's not surprising that that's an insight which wasn't incorporated into language teaching in the 1930s, in the 1940s, and so on. The same with psychology. As I'm sure you know, psychology, like linguistics, is a relatively new science. When language teaching started, there was no psychology of learning, no theories of how learning happens in general and how language learning happens in particular. Over the last century or so, that type of theory has been developed, and theories have come, they've been discredited, they've gone, and other theories have taken their place. So in both linguistics and psychology, we've got theories developing, changing, and influencing language teaching methodology, so that methodology also changed. Very often these changes are seen as very, very sudden, very radical, conflictual type changes. Very often the proponents of a new methodology look upon the proponents of the last methodology as if they came from the Stone Age, didn't know what they were doing. I'd like to suggest it's not like that, that underlying all the changes in methodology there is actually exactly the same aim, and that is to teach natural language in a natural manner. What do I mean by that? By a natural language, I mean language as it really is. Okay? So, for example, as I said before, in the audiolingual period, in around 1950s, 1960s, people just didn't have the insight into language use that we have now. One reason for that is that the technology which has given us that insight just wasn't available. For example, trying to analyse the spoken language was a very, very different matter in the years before recording was possible, when there weren't any tape recorders, when it wasn't possible to actually record and listen carefully to what people were actually saying. So it's not surprising really that in, for example, up to the audiolingual method, the written language was considered to be just a version of the spoken language written down. It's really only been in the last few years, in the last 20 years or so, that we've really understood exactly how different the written and the spoken language actually are. So that's what I mean when I say that I think that the view of what natural language is has changed. It doesn't mean that the aim of language teaching has changed. It's always been to teach natural language, but we've changed the way we look at language. Similarly, our view of the way languages can best be learned has also changed radically. We've yo-yoed back and forwards between approaches which suggest that languages can be learnt analytically by sitting down and studying rules and so on, to approaches which say no, the best way, the only way even, is to be totally exposed to and immersed in the target language with no first language or whatever. There have been lots and lots of different theories, as we'll see later on the course, and trying to incorporate all of these theories into language teaching has meant trying something out, throwing something out, and so on. What about socioeconomic factors? How do they influence what happens in the classroom? Well, when we look at the history of language learning, we'll see, for example, that the direct method was a response to the need to develop an oral method, a method of teaching spoken English to immigrants, particularly in America. Large numbers of immigrants were arriving in America, and the grammar translation method, which had been used up to that point, just couldn't cope with their practical needs. Similarly, audiolingualism was spurred on by the outbreak of the Second World War, and we'll see why later. However, I think socioeconomic factors often influence what we do in the classroom a little bit more subtly. Take, for example, the idea that the student's first language, the L1, shouldn't be used in the classroom. The direct method and the audiolingual method outlawed the use of the L1 for reasons that were directly connected with their theory of learning. They believed it would be detrimental to language learning. However, by about the 1970s, this view of language learning was, if not discredited, at least very, very severely questioned. And yet the idea that the L1 should not in any case be used in the classroom went on and on and on, and is still fairly current today. So why? I'd like to suggest that one of the reasons was simply because of the situation of language teaching at the time. It was a time when there was a lot more social mobility than there had been before. People were starting to go abroad, and people were starting, for example, to come to Britain. And there were very important language schools in places like London, IH for example, which had large numbers of different nationality students coming across, and had to develop a methodology where their teachers didn't need to speak the students' own language, because no teacher could possibly speak all the languages of the students that were in that class. Going on a little bit, then language teachers started going abroad much more often, and the same thing very often happened. They'd arrive in a new country, wouldn't speak the language, but had to be in the classroom next day. So there was a need for a methodology where the teacher didn't speak the student's language. But saying that there's a need for that type of methodology is very different from saying that you shouldn't speak the student's language. I think publishers had a large part to play in that as well. It's much more profitable for a publisher to publish one edition of a book rather than a lot of different language editions. And so the publishers too had a vested interest in this idea that everything in the classroom could be in English. So that's three factors: developments in linguistics, development in psychology, and also socio-economic factors. And in the PowerPoint videos that you're going to be looking at, we'll be looking at those three factors in more detail.